A broken locket hides more than a memory. Welcome to Mystery Tales. I am your host, Gravemind. Share where you're tuning in from today. I love hearing from you all. Your comments make this journey truly special. Let's begin. The June morning dawned fair and bright over St. Mary Mead, the sort of golden day when even the vicar's roses seemed to bloom more proudly, and the village green hummed with the quiet gossip of the postmistress, the milkman, and a scattering of ladies on their way to shop. There was to be a garden fete at Colonel Hargraves's residence, an event long anticipated, for it promised not only a competition of jams and flower arrangements, but also the excitement of a visiting string quartet from London. The Colonel, who prided himself on bringing a touch of refinement to the village, had spared no expense in making the gathering the grandest in recent memory. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the lawns of Hargrave House were filled with guests. Children darted between tables laden with sponge cakes, ladies compared embroidery, and the Colonel stood beaming with his wife beside the refreshment tent. Even Miss Marple was there, quietly seated beneath the shade of a laburnum tree, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the steady flow of human nature in all its forms. To the casual eye, she was nothing more than an elderly gentlewoman enjoying a summer's day. To those who knew her better, her calm expression concealed an alert mind that missed nothing. It was during the interlude, just after the quartet finished their second piece, that the tranquility of the fete was so suddenly shattered. Her scream, a shrill, piercing cry that silenced the chatter and froze the bow mid-stroke, came from the direction of the ornamental lake. Guests hurried forward, skirts swishing and hats tilting dangerously as they pressed toward the source of the disturbance. Colonel Hargraves barked orders for people to stand back, his voice gruff with the authority of an old military man, but curiosity was stronger than command. There, at the water's edge, half submerged among the reeds, lay the body of young Lydia Armitage. Her pale summer frock clung to her figure, her golden hair spread like a halo upon the dark surface, but her lifeless stillness robbed the scene of any grace. In her clenched hand was a small object, glinting strangely in the afternoon sun, a delicate silver locket. Its chain snapped as though torn violently from her neck. The effect upon the company was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Bantry swooned into her husband's arms. The vicar's wife murmured a prayer. Several of the younger ladies burst into tears, while others whispered frantically of accidents, fainting spells, or darker possibilities. And yet, amid the confusion, Miss Marple sat perfectly still. Her needles paused, but her expression one of quiet thought. She had seen tragedy before, far too often to be deceived by appearances. So a drowned girl with a broken locket was not the work of chance. Inspector Craddock was soon summoned from the neighboring town, and before long the fete had collapsed into chaos. People were asked to remain until statements could be taken, and the once gay gathering became a hive of speculation and nervous chatter. A terrible accident, some insisted. A dreadful crime, countered others. The broken locket, passed from hand to hand, became the focus of every whispered theory. It was engraved with initials, E.A., but who was E.A.? Lydia Armitage herself bore no such initials. Miss Marple, watching faces rather than the locket, noted small things, the quick flush on Colonel Hargraves's face when the trinket was shown, the peculiar tightening of Mrs. Price Ridley's lips, the way young Peter Harcourt, Lydia's suitor, looked not at the body but at the locket with unmistakable recognition. To the untrained eye these were trifles, but to Miss Marple they were the faintest outlines of a pattern. As the body was carried away and the fete dispersed in uneasy silence, the village of St. Mary Mead knew with dreadful certainty that life had changed. Death had intruded upon their peace, and with it came the shadow of suspicion. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, quietly reflected that beneath every pleasant surface lies the potential for darkness. The broken locket was more than a trinket. It was the key to a secret, and she suspected the beginning of a story that was far from over. Rain held off overnight, which struck several people as a pity. There is something in a soft English drizzle that makes terrible events feel tidier. As it was, St. Mary Mead woke to a bright, judging sky, and every errand became an excuse for conversation conducted with the air of civic duty. The death at Hargrave House had travelled faster than the milk cart. By 8 o'clock, Mrs. Hartnell had told Mrs. Price Ridley that she had always said Lydia Armitage was a little too pretty to be entirely safe, which Mrs. Price Ridley considered quite an insight and repeated to 3 other women as if inventing it anew. At the grocer's, the assistant cut cheese in anxious wedges while receiving speculation, with the same solemn nod he gave to orders. In the post office, Miss Marple observed a small congregational twitch whenever the bell tinkled, and another person came to send a note, just to check on a friend who had been at the fete. Miss Marple herself went early to the high street with a small shopping basket and an air of mild distraction. People spoke freely to her. They always had. It was agreeable, she knew, to confide in someone who looked as though she might forget things. She bought wool at Mr. Abbott's, blue, though she said she had no project in mind, and listened while Mrs. Bantry, recovered from her swoon, accounted for it with an almost proprietary tremor. So sudden, Jane. 1 minute the quartet, the next, well, it was like a curtain falling. They say the locket was clamped in the poor girl's hand. Engraved, too. Not her initials. E.A., such a strange business. People are very fond of gifts, Miss Marple murmured, particularly when affection is perhaps a little uncertain. It is comforting to wear it hanging on a chain. Mrs. Bantry blinked and agreed, because she liked Miss Marple to be wise. Peter Harcourt was white as paper. You noticed? One expects a young man to look unwell when a girl he admires is taken from him, said Miss Marple gently. Is he quite well in general? I have always thought he sits badly upon his bicycle, which is sometimes a sign of nerves. Mrs. Bantry, who had never correlated bicycling posture with temperament, promised to observe it in future, and hurried on to the butcher's, pleased to carry both gossip and a new criterion into her day. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement poured coffee for Inspector Craddock, in a bright sitting-room that smelt faintly of furniture polish and lilies. The inspector had come to conduct his preliminary business with the cheerful efficiency of a man who disliked fuss and distrusted. Coincidence, Dr. Haydock had given him what he called the provisional outline. Drowning, yes, though the usual caveats and signs that the deceased had not entered the water without some struggle. The broken chain suggested a hand, not a snag. Lydia's wrists bore a faint reddening. One might call it friction, one might call it restraint. There would be more, of course, but not yet. Hand that locket, Craddock said, turning it over in the paper he kept between it and his fingers. A modest thing. No photographs inside, odd considering. Just a pressed violet, quite old. Violets can hold a memory longer than photographs, said Griselda softly. They fade with dignity. Initials E.A., Craddock continued, businesslike. We shall make inquiries. Lydia Armitage, 22, living with her aunt, Mrs. Cartwright, over the Drapers since her parents died. Worked part-time at the reading room and played the piano capably enough to be asked yesterday to turn pages for the quartet. 2 suitors, if the village is to be believed. Peter Harcourt and the Colonel's nephew, Mr. Guy Hargraves. There was also some talk of a lady do-gooder in Much Benham, who wanted Lydia for a secretary. The usual scatter of prospects and perils for a pretty girl in a small place. Griselda, who possessed both common sense and a healthy respect for unpleasant outcomes, said, You will want to speak to Jane Marple. I shall, said Craddock. When I wish to know where people were standing, and how they were looking when they said they were not looking. Miss Marple saves me an afternoon. He found her later, not at home, but in the lane that ran between the vicarage and the green, stooping, apparently, to free a twig from her stocking. It was astonishing how often Miss Marple contrived to be exactly where one wished to see her, She straightened at once and smiled with the meek triumph of a child caught out with a biscuit. "My dear Inspector," she said, "how courteous of you to take the air." "It is always instructive air in St. Mary Mead," he replied. "Might I walk you to the green?" They went together, an elderly lady and a neat, compact man, and if anyone watched them from behind a lace curtain, as someone always did, they saw nothing but civility. Craddock asked very little, and Miss Marple offered even less. But what she offered was useful. Lydia had arrived alone at the fete. She had been cheerful, charming with the children, careful with the music. She had slipped away for 10 minutes shortly before the scream. Peter Harcourt had followed her at a distance, because young men are like spaniels, eager but embarrassed. Mrs. Price Ridley had made a remark about young persons taking liberties with the shrubbery, by which she meant that Lydia had been seen near the lakeside path with a gentleman. The gentleman could not be identified. Mrs. Price Ridley's idea of a description was the kind of man who should know better, which covered, Miss Marple noted, 3/4 of the adult male population. "And the locket?" Craddock prompted. "I saw it twice," said Miss Marple. "Once, years ago, on a lady who died of influenza and left nothing but debts and 3 silver-backed brushes. Once, yesterday, in the hand of a girl who could not possibly have afforded such a thing. That is the sort of pattern one notices if one has done a quantity of knitting." He hid a smile. "You think the locket did not belong to Lydia? I think young women prefer their own initials when they are sentimental. When they are practical, they prefer something that can be exchanged." They reached the green as Mrs. Price Ridley swept past, her hat bristling with moral consequence. "Inspector," she said, "you will want to speak to the Colonel." A scandalous lack of supervision over his grounds. "And as for that nephew of his, modern views, I am told. I consider modern views extremely dangerous. I shall speak to everyone." "Mrs. Price Ridley," said Craddock pleasantly. "And do," she returned. "Ask Mrs. Cartwright about the gentleman who visited her niece last Thursday. I was in the chemist's when she bought cold cream, and it is astonishing how women chat about callers when they think they are only discussing their pores." She sailed on, "Gratified to have assisted." "Thursday," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "There was a thunderstorm that afternoon. I recall because the geraniums survived on natural water and did not resent the hose in the way they sometimes do. One remembers such things." Craddock left her at the corner and went about his questions. He saw Peter Harcourt at his mother's cottage, a modest place with lace curtains carefully laundered. Peter was pale, agreeable, and hopelessly sincere. He admitted that he had looked for Lydia by the lake because she liked walking there, and because Guy had been bothering her with jokes that weren't jokes. He had not reached her, he said. He had been delayed by Mrs. Bantry's spaniel, which had sat down in the path and refused to move, a detail he offered with such earnest absurdity that it felt true. He knew the locket, yes, because Lydia had once shown him a photograph of it in a magazine, pointing out how tasteful a simple silver pendant could be. "But not that one," he insisted. "That one was older. She said it was too grown up for her. That she'd never wear another person's initials." At Hargrave House, Craddock found the Colonel stiff with outrage at disorder, and Guy Hargraves loose with charm. The nephew shrugged about the lake. "Everyone wanders there, Inspector. Lydia was a pretty girl. If I said a kind word, it was as one says a kind word to a garden statue. Peter is the sort to misconstrue kindness." He looked at his nails, not at Craddock. "As for trinkets, I prefer them on women who enjoy being admired." The Colonel interrupted to say that it was monstrous to suggest any failure on the part of his staff. The gardeners knew their duties. The undergardener had been at the rose tent, the footman at the champagne, and if young ladies insisted on fainting into water features, society must accept some responsibility. He grew red as he spoke, and Miss Marple, who had been shown into the drawing-room by a harassed maid and sat quietly awaiting her moment to leave a calling card, noted that Mrs. Hargraves did not correct him. Mrs. Hargraves's face did something more interesting. It arranged itself into politeness, while her hands worried a tiny thread at the edge of her cuff until it frayed. By afternoon, the village had set itself to the complicated business of remembering things usefully. Several people remembered that Lydia had gone more often to Much Benham of late. One remembered seeing her with a woman in a smart hat outside the library. Another recalled she had changed her gloves at the fete, white for grey, an unnecessary act in August unless a glove had been dirtied. No one could say where the grey pair had gone. Mrs. Cartwright, Lydia's aunt, received visitors with a dry-eyed composure that left some uncomfortable. She spoke of Lydia's virtues with practiced economy and no illusions. "She wanted more than we have here," she said. "I don't blame her. But not at the price people pay in these little places, where every step is counted and every gift has an arithmetic." When dusk came, Miss Marple took her knitting onto her neat front step and considered arithmetic. The village had supplied motives in abundance: admiration, jealousy, the restlessness of youth, the proprietorship of men who had never owned anything worthy, and yet she felt the steady tug of something smaller, less dramatic and therefore more telling. It was not the locket, though the locket was important. It was a remark about gloves, made by someone who would never bother to notice gloves, unless she had been trained by habit to notice surfaces. It was the violet within the locket, which was memory rather than identity. And it was Thursday's storm, an afternoon when a caller could stay longer than he meant because rain makes decency linger. She finished a row, slipped the needle neatly through the wool, and set the work aside. Tomorrow people would be firmer in their recollections, which made them less reliable. Tonight, as light thinned over the roofs, the village was telling the truth by accident, and that, she knew, was the best time to listen. Inspector Craddock spent the following morning methodically visiting households, though he quickly found that in St. Mary Mead one never really visited a household without simultaneously visiting the entire village. Each word spoken at a doorstep found its way by tea-time to the grocer's, and by supper it was seasoned, altered, and polished until it bore little resemblance to the original. The inspector disliked that, but Miss Marple, observing quietly from her garden gate, knew it was precisely in those alterations that truth sometimes hid itself. People embroidered facts only in the directions that suited their natures. If one knew the stitch, one could read the whole pattern. Mrs. Cartwright, Lydia's aunt, received Craddock with brisk sorrow. She was not a demonstrative woman, though her hands shook slightly as she poured the tea. She spoke of Lydia's restlessness with an edge of disapproval. A girl ought to be content with steady work and proper company. Lydia fancied herself destined for more, pianos and poetry and such fripperies. She made friends easily, but not always wisely. She admitted that Lydia had been visited last week by a gentleman, but she insisted she had not pressed the matter. He seemed respectable enough, though his manner was rather urgent. "Lydia told me nothing. She had secrets." Mrs. Cartwright's lips pressed thinly, as though secrecy were a greater sin than any crime. When Craddock asked whether Lydia had ever mentioned a locket, the aunt frowned. "Never to me. I should have noticed. I notice things of value. It is my duty." She did not notice, however, that her denial was contradicted by the faintest hesitation in her eyes, which Miss Marple, seated at the corner of the room with her knitting basket, did not fail to register. Jane Marple rarely intruded upon conversation. She simply let her presence be overlooked, as though she were part of the furniture, and thus she heard far more than most. Outside, the inspector exhaled heavily. "Secrets, secrets everywhere, Miss Marple. The difficulty is knowing which are worth our time." "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "It is very like jam-making, I think. One starts with fruit and sugar, and a very great deal of froth. The froth must be skimmed away, but it is always instructive to notice what it looks like before it disappears. The froth tells one about the fruit." Craddock smiled despite himself. "And what fruit do you see in this case?" "Why, Inspector?" said Miss Marple. "I see that Lydia Armitage was a young woman who had more admirers than she had time for, and that one of them, at least, wished to leave her a token. A token is a curious thing. It is often meant more for the giver's reassurance than for the recipient's pleasure. One must ask what reassurance was sought. By the afternoon, the talk of the village had become louder, shriller. At the tea shop, Mrs. Price Ridley sat with her companions like a queen upon her throne. "It is obvious," she declared, "that Peter Harcourt is to blame. A young man of no fortune, entirely besotted and quite unstable. Everyone knows he was jealous of Mr. Guy Hargraves. I have long suspected a dangerous temperament beneath that pale exterior. Men who cycle badly, as Miss Marple has remarked, are never to be trusted." Miss Marple, sitting at a nearby table with her knitting, looked up only long enough to say, "Jealousy does make people untidy, but sometimes it makes them careful. Too careful for the sort of blunder we saw yesterday." Her words were politely ignored, as they so often were when they did not suit the listener's inclination. But Miss Marple noticed the quick sideways glance of Mr. Abbott, the wool merchant who had stopped for a scone. Mr. Abbott, normally indifferent to gossip, looked suddenly attentive when Guy Hargraves's name was mentioned. It was not jealousy in his face, but wariness, as though he recognized a dangerous turn in the conversation. That to Miss Marple was worth 10 of Mrs. Price Ridley's speeches. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock conducted a formal interview with Guy Hargraves at the Colonel's house. Guy was handsome, charming, and restless. He laughed at suggestions of rivalry. "Inspector, Lydia was a pleasant girl, but surely, you see, she was not of my world. I danced with her, yes, and perhaps teased her a little. But really, to suggest that I would involve myself in melodrama, ridiculous." He waved his hand, "as though banishing the entire matter." "Yet you were seen with her by the lake," Craddock pressed. Guy's expression hardened. "If I spoke with her there, it was no more than courtesy. It was she who lingered, not I. I have nothing to do with this ugly business." The Colonel, sitting stiff-backed in his armchair, interjected, "The boy is right. You must look elsewhere, Inspector. Lydia was imprudent. Young women are. This is what comes of imprudence." His tone carried the sharp finality of a man accustomed to issuing orders. Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea in the same room by Mrs. Hargraves, who thought her company innocuous, watched the Colonel's wife again. Mrs. Hargraves, silent and pale, stirred her cup slowly, her eyes fixed on the dark swirl of tea leaves. She did not defend her nephew, nor did she condemn him. Her silence was a silence of knowledge, not ignorance. Miss Marple's mind tucked that detail away, like a thread left loose on fine linen. That evening the village grew restless. Lamps glowed in windows, but curtains remained slightly ajar, as though every household wished to keep watch on its neighbors. The atmosphere was not of grief alone, but of expectation, as though each resident half anticipated another revelation before dawn. Whispers of the locket spread. Some said it belonged to a secret fiancé, others to a married man, still others to a stranger from Much Benham. The initials E.A. had become a puzzle piece everyone tried to force into their preferred solution. Yet Miss Marple, seated by her fire, reflected that initials were the most treacherous of clues. They were too easy to seize upon, and therefore too easy to manipulate. She considered instead the violet pressed within the locket. Fay violet, carefully preserved, spoke not of wealth or pride, but of sentiment cherished in silence. A flower from the past, held close until it crumbled, was far more revealing than silver or initials. It told her something of the giver's heart, though not yet of their hand in murder. And then there was the matter of Lydia's gloves, mentioned so carelessly by one of the villagers. White for grey, changed mid-afternoon and then gone missing. Gloves could be lost, certainly, but they could also conceal marks upon the skin, or be dirtied by actions never meant for daylight. The village settled uneasily into the night, but Miss Marple did not settle at all. She sat awake longer than usual, her knitting needles resting in her lap. her mind quietly arranging patterns from the day's observations. Somewhere in those patterns, amid gloves, violets, glances, and silences, lay the first true thread of the truth. She had not yet pulled it, but she knew it was there. And when she pulled, the whole web would shift. By the following morning, the air in St. Mary Mead had thickened into a peculiar blend of righteousness and apprehension. The constable's steady trudge from cottage to cottage had convinced the villagers that the investigation was well underway, and they felt obliged, indeed almost privileged, to offer their opinions with increasing confidence. Among those opinions, two names rose repeatedly to the surface: Peter Harcourt and Guy Hargraves. The village had decided upon its suspects, and it clung to them with the obstinacy of habit. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley was unequivocal. "It is Peter, of course. Everyone knows he was consumed by jealousy. Men of his stamp always end in violence." She spoke with such conviction that the young assistant nearly sliced his thumb while cutting cheese. The theory gained traction, and by mid-morning it was repeated in tones of certainty in the post office. The bakers, and even by the milkman who had never once exchanged a word with Peter Harcourt. Inspector Craddock, practical to a fault, had already given the young man considerable attention. Peter admitted freely to following Lydia toward the lake, though his version of events placed him several minutes behind her, delayed, as he claimed, by Mrs. Bantry's disobedient spaniel. His words were earnest, his expression pale, and his voice broke when he spoke of Lydia's body. "I never reached her," he insisted. "If I had, she would still be alive." Yet sincerity, Craddock knew, could be practiced, and grief could as easily mask guilt as innocence. In contrast, Guy Hargraves's charm seemed almost too smooth. He dismissed Lydia as pleasant company, nothing more, but his nonchalance rang hollow. Several villagers reported having seen him with Lydia by the lake path. Mrs. Price Ridley, who made it her business to scrutinize everyone's comings and goings, claimed that Lydia had looked distressed when speaking with Guy. Mr. Abbott, the wool merchant, less inclined to drama, admitted that he had noticed Guy glancing nervously when the locket was produced at the fete. To Inspector Craddock, the nephew's indifference concealed more than it revealed. Miss Marple, meanwhile, heard the villagers' collective verdicts with a look of mild amusement. She never contradicted them directly. Instead, she let them speak and observed how each chose their villain. It was striking to her that those inclined to strict moral codes, Mrs. Price Ridley, for instance, saw Peter Harcourt's youthful passion as dangerous, while those impressed by status and good looks, like young Bessie from the tea shop, excused Guy Hargraves entirely. People saw what they expected to see, she reflected, and their expectations said far more about themselves than about the crime. At Mrs. Cartwright's lodgings, the atmosphere was subdued. Lydia's room remained much as she had left it, though there were curious omissions. Her favourite brooch was missing, along with the grey gloves she had changed out of on the day of the fete. Inspector Craddock noticed these absences with interest. Mrs. Cartwright waved them away. She was careless with her things, she said sharply, though her voice trembled. Miss Marple, gently fingering the neat embroidery on a pillowcase, remarked, "Careless girls do lose things, of course, but they rarely lose two items at once unless they are placed together for a purpose." Mrs. Cartwright said nothing, only folded her arms more tightly, as if shielding herself from further inquiry. In the afternoon, Inspector Craddock called both Peter Harcourt and Guy Hargraves separately to the vicarage for formal questioning. Miss Marple, with the quiet inevitability of one who always found herself in the right place at the right time, happened to be invited to tea by Griselda Clement. She occupied a corner chair, knitting calmly, her eyes lowered to her needles while her ears missed nothing. Peter came first. His voice was strained but steady. He admitted to jealousy, but not to violence. "She liked him, Guy," he confessed. She laughed at his jokes. "She said they meant nothing, but I could see it. I couldn't bear it, but I never..." His voice broke and he turned away, shoulders trembling. I only wanted to marry her. I wanted her safe, not like this. His grief seemed raw, yet Craddock pressed him firmly. Why had Lydia been seen changing her gloves? Did Peter know of the locket? At that, Peter shook his head fiercely. She would never wear another man's initials. She told me so herself. Miss Marple looked up at this with quiet interest, though she said nothing. Guy Hargreaves arrived an hour later, exuding careless charm. He lounged in the vicar's study chair as though it were a drawing-room armchair, smiling with practised ease. "The Inspector, really, you cannot think I had anything to do with this melodrama. Lydia was sweet, of course, but one cannot be held responsible for every young lady who takes one seriously. If she imagined there was more to my attentions, that is hardly my fault." His tone was dismissive, yet his eyes flickered, just for an instant, when Craddock placed the locket on the table. "A sentimental trinket," Guy said quickly. "Not mine, I assure you. I would hardly give a girl something so provincial." It was then that Miss Marple, apparently lost in her knitting, remarked softly, "But a violet is never provincial. It is a very modest flower, but modesty can carry more weight in memory than grander blooms." Guy looked sharply at her, surprised, and in that quick, defensive glance Miss Marple saw more than any denial could conceal. The inspector, though, had enough for now. Both young men were plausible suspects, Peter with his jealousy and opportunity, and Guy with his charm and evasions. Yet Craddock was no closer to proof. The broken locket, the missing gloves, the aunt's evasions, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the church spire, Miss Marple sat by her window, reflecting on the day's exchanges. The village had chosen its suspects, but she had learned long ago that the obvious answers often served as convenient shields for the less obvious truth. The locket troubled her still, not for what it revealed, but for what it concealed. A pressed violet, initials that did not match, and a chain snapped as though in anger. Such tokens were rarely accidents. They were deliberate, weighted with intention. And then there was Mrs. Hargreaves, silent at her husband's side, her fingers worrying at the cuff of her sleeve. Miss Marple thought of her expression when Guy was questioned, the way she had avoided both defence and condemnation. A silence like that, Miss Marple knew, was not empty at all. It was filled with knowledge, carefully contained. The village might rest content in blaming Peter Harcourt or Guy Hargreaves, but Jane Marple's needles clicked steadily as she considered the matter. Human behaviour was infinitely varied, yet always in its essence predictable. People betrayed themselves not by what they confessed, but by what they could not quite hide. Somewhere among the missing gloves, the broken chain, and the violet, pressed into silver, the true story of Lydia Armitage's death lay waiting. And Miss Marple intended to find it, stitch by quiet stitch. The days that followed saw the case advance no further in the eyes of the villagers, though in truth each small remark and recollection was drawing a finer web about the tragedy. The police maintained their scrutiny of Peter Harcourt and Guy Hargreaves, and the two young men carried their burdens differently, Peter with pale earnestness, and Guy with an insolence that bordered on arrogance. Both postures were convincing enough to those who had already chosen a side, and yet Miss Marple, in her quiet way, noticed that the villagers' zeal in fixing blame was already beginning to tire. People grew uneasy when explanations did not settle quickly. The longer suspicion lingered, the more it threatened to implicate themselves. It was during one such afternoon, while Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden taking tea with Griselda Clement, that a detail surfaced which others would have thought inconsequential. The vicar's wife, who had an eye for fashion, if not always for discretion, remarked on Lydia's habit of changing her look at the oddest times. Griselda had noticed it on the day of the fete. She came into the refreshment tent with grey gloves, rather serviceable ones, and left wearing white. I thought it strange she should carry 2 pairs for such an occasion. White gloves are impractical when one expects to pour lemonade. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. Yes, indeed, she murmured. White does show every stain. One wonders why she changed them. Griselda, pleased to be thought observant, continued without realizing the depth of her remark. She slipped away to the shrubbery path soon after. I thought she must have seen someone there. When she returned, she had the white pair. I dare say she simply fancied them prettier. But Miss Marple, staring at her knitting, recalled another small fact. The missing grey gloves. They had not been found among Lydia's belongings, and if one discarded serviceable gloves for a prettier pair, one usually left them behind somewhere, yet they had not turned up at Hargrave House. To Miss Marple's mind, their absence spoke more loudly than their presence might have. Gloves, after all, were excellent for hiding what should not be seen, scratches, bruises, or stains of a more sinister kind. That evening, Inspector Craddock stopped at Miss Marple's cottage, weary from interviews that yielded more heat than light. He sat stiffly while she offered tea and seed cake. We circle round the same ground, Miss Marple. Harcourt is jealous, Hargraves is evasive, the locket is a puzzle, and the gloves, well, the gloves are simply lost. No one seems able to put a hand on them. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. It is rather interesting, don't you think, that no one has found them? I recall a maid once in this village who dropped a pair of gloves in the churchyard. They were discovered within an hour, and she was very much ashamed. Gloves, in my experience, are found very quickly, because they are of such practical use to those who have fewer pairs than they might wish, unless, of course, someone has taken care to prevent them being found. Craddock frowned. You think they were destroyed? Why would anyone bother with that? Because gloves are peculiar little witnesses, Miss Marple said softly. They cling to things, Inspector. A burr, a thread, a stain. Gloves are faithful keepers of secrets. Someone was careful enough to remove them altogether. He studied her with reluctant respect. You mean someone other than Lydia herself, Miss? Marple gave a mild smile, as if she had been speaking of knitting patterns. Why, naturally. Young women rarely discard the practical for the ornamental unless they are compelled, and Lydia, I suspect, was compelled. The inspector had little to offer in return. Without tangible proof, he could not pursue the matter further. Yet Miss Marple's words clung to him, unsettling his methodical reasoning. The following day a new ripple of gossip disturbed the village calm. Mrs. Bantry, who possessed the happy knack of being in the wrong place at the right time, declared that she had seen Mrs. Hargraves quietly instructing the housemaid to burn a bundle of rubbish late on the evening of the fete. I thought it odd, Mrs. Bantry confided, for such a particular woman to burn things herself, and she was very sharp with the maid, as though afraid someone might ask questions. The tale spread swiftly, acquiring embellishments as it travelled. Some said it was a bundle of letters, others that it was a child's doll. But Miss Marple, hearing the account at the tea shop, understood immediately what might have been consigned to the flames. Gloves, when stained with something unpleasant, burned all too neatly. She took a slow walk past Hargrave House that evening, pausing at the gate as if admiring the roses. Mrs. Hargraves herself appeared on the terrace, pale in the last of the sunlight. Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment Mrs. Hargrave's hand moved to her sleeve, plucking again at the tiny, frayed thread Miss Marple had noticed before. The movement was nervous, compulsive, and entirely revealing. Miss Marple inclined her head politely and walked on, her mind settling more firmly around the pattern forming. That night she considered it all by lamplight, the vanished gloves, the locket with its pressed violet, the aunt's careful evasions, and Mrs. Hargraves's silence. It was not yet enough to draw conclusions, but it was enough to know that the truth lay not with the obvious suspects. Peter Harcourt's grief was genuine. Guy Hargraves's charm was shallow but not murderous. The true danger, Miss Marple reflected, came from those who hid their motives beneath layers of propriety and silence. She knitted steadily, the click of her needles filling the quiet cottage. In her mind she arranged the pieces once more. Gloves were not simply lost, flowers were not pressed by accident, silences were not without weight. Somewhere between those three small details lay the hidden clue that would open the path to Lydia Armitage's killer. And when that clue revealed itself fully, as it must, Miss Marple knew she would be ready. The village, so eager to assign blame and be rid of discomfort, had overlooked what truly mattered. She, however, never overlooked anything at all. The unease in St. Mary Mead deepened in the days that followed, like a shadow stretching across every parlour and hedgerow. People who ordinarily passed their lives in cheerful trivialities now spoke in whispers, their glances quick and furtive. It was not only grief that lingered over the village, it was suspicion, a sense that behind every lace curtain some darker truth might be waiting to slip into the open. The murder of Lydia Armitage had unsettled long-buried matters, and as Miss Marple quietly observed, such matters rarely remained buried for long. Inspector Craddock, methodical and persistent, continued to pursue the most immediate suspects. Peter Harcourt was watched closely, and Guy Hargraves too, though his uncle's influence made formal accusations delicate. Yet what truly occupied the inspector's time were the stories and counter-stories trickling from the villagers, each one a thread that seemed to lead into an old quarrel or a carefully hidden resentment. Miss Marple, listening to the tales, recognized in them not chaos but the emergence of a pattern. People, when pressed, revealed far more than they intended. Mrs. Cartwright, Lydia's aunt, became a figure of scrutiny. She kept to her rooms, above the drapers, accepting callers with a stiff politeness that did little to soften her reputation for severity. To some she confided her bitterness. Lydia had been a burden, always wanting more than her position allowed. To others she hinted darkly that Lydia had been too free with her admirers. Yet when Miss Marple visited under the pretext of bringing a basket of scones, she noticed something her neighbours had not. Mrs. Cartwright's eyes, red from weeping in private, did not match her tone of cold detachment. Grief, Miss Marple knew, takes many disguises, but guilt has its own, and the difference lay not in tears, but in what one refused to speak. Rumours of a visitor from Much Benham spread wider. Some said it was a lady who had offered Lydia employment, others that it was a man of means who wished to marry her. Mrs. Bantry, who thrived on the thrill of discovery, insisted she had seen Lydia walking arm in arm with a stranger near the railway station. This claim was challenged by the postmistress, who declared Lydia had been at the reading room that very hour. Yet amid the contradictions one fact held steady. Lydia had been entangled with someone outside the village, and that someone might well have given her the locket with the pressed violet. More troubling still were the whispers surrounding the Hargraves household. Mrs. Hargraves, usually so composed, was observed by her maid weeping in the early morning. The maid, eager to share her discovery, told anyone who would listen that her mistress had locked herself in the drawing-room and burned private papers. Colonel Hargraves dismissed the tale as nonsense, but his wife's pallor and her compulsive habit of plucking at the frayed thread of her sleeve lent the story more weight than denial could dispel. Miss Marple reflected that silence, when coupled with small nervous movements, often spoke louder than words. At the vicarage one evening, the inspector voiced his frustration over tea. "The whole village is a maze of half-truths, Miss Marple. Every path I follow doubles back upon itself. The aunt with her evasions, the nephew with his charm, the boy with his jealousy, the wife with her silences. Every one of them conceals something, but which concealment matters?" Miss Marple sipped her tea serenely. "Concealment always matters, Inspector. But not all concealments point to murder. Many are merely the little vanities and follies of human nature. The difficulty is to distinguish between what people hide for themselves and what they hide because another's life depends upon it. Do you mean to say you see a difference already? He asked, half exasperated, half hopeful. I mean only, dear Inspector, that Lydia Armitage died not because of who she was, but because of what she knew. And one must look carefully to discover what that knowledge was. The next afternoon provided a sharper glimpse into the village's fractures. A chance encounter in the high street between Peter Harcourt and Guy Hargreaves nearly descended into blows. Peter accused Guy of trifling with Lydia's affections, his voice shaking with rage. Guy, laughing with cold disdain, called Peter a provincial fool who mistook a girl's smile for devotion. Several villagers intervened, but not before both young men had revealed their feelings plainly. The quarrel confirmed for many that one of them must indeed be guilty. Yet Miss Marple, watching from the shade of the post office, noted not their words but their faces. Peter's anguish was genuine, raw and uncalculated, while Guy's insolence carried beneath it a flicker of fear. Fear not of the inspector, but of exposure. That evening, Griselda Clement confided to Miss Marple another curious detail. While tidying the parish hall, she had overheard Mrs. Price Ridley pressing Mrs. Bantry about the locket. It belonged to someone Lydia should never have been involved with, Mrs. Price Ridley said in a low, portentous tone. I know it, because I once saw that very locket at a dinner in Much Benham years ago, and I know to whom it belonged. But when pressed further, she refused to name the person. A lady of respectability, she insisted, whose name must not be dragged into such scandal. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind quickening. If the locket had indeed been seen before in Much Benham, then Lydia's entanglement was not with some anonymous suitor, but with a figure already connected to the village by social ties. The initials E.A. had been a puzzle. Now they suggested not only a name, but a danger that someone was determined to keep hidden. Late that night, Miss Marple sat alone by her lamp, her knitting in her lap forgotten. The village, in its eager chatter, had begun to reveal its secrets one by one. Lydia's aunt, burdened by something she would not confess, Mrs. Hargreaves, whose silence concealed a private terror, Guy Hargreaves, who wore arrogance as a shield, and somewhere in Much Benham, a connection to a locket with a pressed violet and the initials E.A. The gloves, too, hovered in her mind, gloves discarded not carelessly, but purposefully destroyed. They might have carried the most damning mark of all, and someone had known it. The web was tightening, though the pattern remained incomplete. Yet Miss Marple, with the quiet patience of one who had seen many such tangles, knew the truth could not remain hidden much longer. People, like threads, fray when pulled at the right angle, and she had already begun to see where to tug. The revelation, when it came, was not thunderous but quiet, as such things often are in St. Mary Mead. It began with the postmistress, who prided herself on never opening letters, yet always contrived to know their contents. She mentioned in passing that a telegram had arrived from Much Benham, addressed to Mrs. Cartwright. Urgent, she told Mrs. Bantry at the counter, and written in such haste the clerk could hardly decipher it. Something about arrangements, though what arrangements a grieving aunt might have, I couldn't say. Within hours the village hummed with speculation. Some thought it a distant relative arriving to settle Lydia's affairs. Others whispered of debts, and one imaginative voice suggested a secret husband. Inspector Craddock, upon hearing of it, lost no time in questioning Mrs. Cartwright, but the aunt, rigid and tight-lipped, insisted it was nothing of consequence, a matter of household accounts. Her eyes, however, flickered toward the desk drawer where the telegram had been hastily concealed. Miss Marple, who happened to be present with her knitting bag, observed the gesture and tucked it quietly into her store of remembered details. She had no need to see the telegram to know that it troubled Mrs. Cartwright deeply, and not for reasons of housekeeping. It was that same evening that the twist took full shape. The constable, searching the bank of the ornamental lake once more, turned up a sodden scrap of fabric caught in the reeds. It proved to be one of Lydia's missing grey gloves, its fingers stained with something darker than mud. Dr. Haydock was summoned and confirmed in his brisk manner that the discoloration was blood. The glove concealed until now was proof that Lydia had struggled before entering the water. More importantly, it suggested she had reached out, perhaps grasped someone hard enough to draw blood. The discovery spread like wildfire through the village. Suddenly the air was thick with accusations. People remembered scratches on Peter Harcourt's hand from a bicycle mishap, though he swore they were days old. Guy Hargreaves was observed wearing gloves himself the following morning, which struck many as suspicious in the heat of June. Even Colonel Hargreaves was whispered about. His temper was well known, and more than one villager muttered that the colonel's brusque manner might hide a violent streak. Every scratched hand, every hastily donned glove, became a potential confession, yet Miss Marple saw in it something more subtle. She knew bloodstains rarely told the whole story. They merely pointed to proximity. What mattered was that only one glove had been found. The other was still missing. Why discard one and not the other, unless the second had been dealt with differently? It was the kind of inconsistency that drew her mind like a thread pulling at a seam. Someone had panicked, destroying one glove yet overlooking or failing to retrieve its companion. That lapse spoke of haste, and haste, Miss Marple reflected, was always revealing. Inspector Craddock pursued the obvious course. He summoned both young men again, examining their hands with professional severity. Peter's palms bore faint healing scratches, but he held them out without flinching. "From brambles on the path," he insisted. "I was looking for her. I tore myself scrambling through." His voice broke on the last word, and even Craddock, hardened though he was, felt a flicker of pity. Guy Hargreaves, on the other hand, displayed smooth, unblemished hands, smirking as though amused by the exercise. But Miss Marple, who sat quietly in the corner under the pretext of counting stitches, noticed the faintest trace of powder at his wrist, the kind of powder women use to mask a mark. A man careless in his charm might think such concealment sufficient. Yet to Miss Marple it was a louder confession than any cut. The village, of course, grew restless with this new turn. Mrs. Price Ridley declared triumphantly that she had always suspected blood would tell. Mrs. Bantry wept afresh, saying it was too dreadful for words. Griselda Clement remarked with a sigh that the truth seemed always just beyond reach, like a hand slipping away in the dark. To which Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful, replied, "Yes, my dear, and sometimes one must ask why it slipped, and who allowed it to do so." The following day brought still another complication. A young clerk from Much Benham arrived at the vicarage, seeking Inspector Craddock. He carried with him not only inquiries but a name. A locket matching the description of Lydia's, with the initials E.A., had once belonged to a woman of local repute, Evelyn Arkwright, widow of a solicitor, known for her genteel airs and unfortunate debts. The locket had been missing for years, presumed sold to settle accounts. Yet here it was, resurfacing in the hand of a murdered girl. The connection was undeniable, though the explanation remained elusive. Miss Marple listened to the account with calm composure. A locket that had passed from a respectable widow into Lydia's possession. How curious. She thought of Mrs. Cartwright's evasions, of Mrs. Hargraves's secretive burnings, of Guy's too careful hands. The pieces were moving, aligning themselves with delicate inevitability. Lydia, ambitious and restless, had known more than was safe. She had known of a past best forgotten, and the locket had been her link to it. For some, that knowledge was dangerous enough to kill. As the sun set behind the village roofs, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles still. The villagers, she knew, would continue to chatter of gloves and suspects, weaving their own narratives to make sense of fear. But beneath the chatter lay something colder and more certain. Someone among them had killed to preserve a secret, bound up with the broken locket, and the careless haste of a single missing glove would in time betray them. She had seen it too often to doubt. The twist was not only in the discovery of the glove, nor in the resurfacing of the Locket's history, but in the sudden shift of the village itself. Where once the tragedy had seemed a distant horror, now it had become personal, pressing upon every household. Everyone began to wonder if they themselves might be drawn into the web of suspicion. And in that unease, Miss Marple saw her opportunity. People revealed the most when they feared being revealed themselves. The trick was to watch, quietly, and wait. The discovery of the glove had unsettled the village like a stone dropped into a pond, the ripples reaching into every drawing room and shop. Yet for all the noise and speculation it provoked, Miss Marple knew the answer would not be found in what people shouted, but in what they tried not to say. That knowledge guided her as she moved about the village with her usual mild manner, accepting cups of tea and listening to confidences as if she were nothing more than a sympathetic old lady with too much time on her hands. In truth, she was watching, waiting for the moment when one small push would expose the truth. It was Mrs. Hargraves who drew her attention most keenly. The Colonel's wife had taken to her rooms with headaches, emerging only rarely and always looking paler, her hands clasped tightly as though holding herself together. Miss Marple called one afternoon, bringing a posy of sweet peas from her garden. They sat in the drawing-room together, the curtains half drawn, the smell of scorched paper faintly lingering, despite the attempt to mask it with lavender. Mrs. Hargraves thanked her with polite gratitude, yet her eyes darted nervously toward the hearth, as if it still held secrets. Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as her knitting needles. "So dreadful what has happened. Poor Lydia. And that locket, too, such a pretty thing. I remember seeing one very like it years ago. Belonged to a Mrs. Arkwright of Much Benham. Such a sad story. They say she had debts she could never clear." The faintest tremor crossed Mrs. Hargraves's face. "I wouldn't know," she said quickly. Lydia was a sweet girl, but impulsive. It is not surprising if she came by trinkets that were not rightly hers. "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed, arranging her knitting in her lap, "though it does make one wonder who pressed the violet. That was done with such care. Young girls rarely take that trouble, unless it is for someone they truly cherish." The silence stretched, and Mrs. Hargraves's fingers returned to that frayed thread at her cuff, plucking and worrying it until it unraveled. Miss Marple saw it and knew. Nerves like that were not born of grief alone. They were born of fear. The following evening Miss Marple went to the vicarage, where Inspector Craddock sat with his notes spread untidily across the table. "We have the glove, we have the locket, we have 2 young men who could each be guilty, and we have an aunt who knows more than she admits," he said, rubbing his temples. "But it refuses to settle. It is as though the case hides itself every time I come near." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "because you look where the light is, and not where the shadow falls." Craddock looked at her sharply. "You mean you see more?" "I mean only that one must give people the chance to betray themselves. They will, you know. People cannot help it. They reveal themselves when they believe no one notices." She left him then with the air of a woman making only a passing observation. Yet her mind was already arranging the stage for what she knew must come. A test, gentle, undemanding on the surface, but designed to nudge the guilty into betraying what they most wished to hide. The opportunity arose the next afternoon. The Colonel, determined to restore a sense of normality, insisted on holding a small tea for a few neighbors. He declared it a show of stiff upper lip, though in truth it was more an assertion of control over a household that was slipping into unease. Miss Marple was invited, of course. No village gathering was ever complete without her quiet presence. Inspector Craddock, too, found a reason to attend, observing silently from the edge of the room. Conversation flowed awkwardly, the gaiety strained. Peter Harcourt sat stiffly, answering questions with the grimness of one still under suspicion. Guy Hargraves lounged carelessly, though his laughter was brittle. Mrs. Hargraves, pale and withdrawn, poured tea with trembling hands. Miss Marple, seated near the window, let her knitting rest on her lap and spoke in her mildest, most unthreatening tone. "It is curious," she said, as if to no one in particular, "how gloves can betray us. One may take such care with them, and yet they show every mark. Blood, for instance, is dreadfully difficult to remove. It soaks into the stitching. I remember once a maid who tried to scrub hers after an accident in the kitchen. No use at all, she was discovered at once." The words hung in the air. Peter Harcourt flushed, looking down at his hands. Guy Hargraves gave a short, dismissive laugh, but his eyes flicked to his aunt with a speed too quick to disguise. Mrs. Hargraves's teacup rattled against the saucer. She spilled a few drops of tea onto the cloth and dabbed at them feverishly with her handkerchief. Her face drained of all colour. Miss Marple, seemingly absorbed in rolling up her yarn, continued in the same placid tone. "One wonders what became of poor Lydia's gloves. Such a pity they were not both found. If they had been destroyed, of course, it would have been for a reason. Something that must not be seen." The Colonel barked an irritable remark about village gossip, but the damage was done. Mrs. Hargraves had betrayed herself. Her trembling, her frantic dabbing, her silence more eloquent than any words. Miss Marple saw it, Inspector Craddock saw it, and even Guy's smirk faltered under the weight of it. When the tea was over and the guests departed, Miss Marple lingered in the hall to adjust her shawl. Mrs. Hargraves passed her then, eyes downcast. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand upon her arm. "My dear," she said softly, "the burden of silence can be heavier than any punishment. I think you know that better than most." Mrs. Hargraves looked up sharply, fear and defiance struggling in her expression, but she said nothing, only turned away, her steps hurried as though escape was still possible. Miss Marple watched her go, her own face calm and unreadable. She knew the moment was close. The guilty soul, pressed by fear and conscience alike, was already beginning to fray. It would not take much more. That night Miss Marple sat by her window, the village lying quiet under a pale moon. She had given the guilty their test, and they had failed it. Now the task would be to draw the net tight, gently and without haste until there was no escape. Murder, she reflected, was never as clever as its perpetrators believed. Human nature, with all its small vanities and flaws, was always the betrayer. And Lydia Armitage, poor child, had been destroyed by a secret that could not remain hidden. Soon, very soon, it would speak for itself. The morning after the Colonel's uneasy tea, St. Mary Mead wore a strained air, as though the very hedges and rooftops were listening for something that had not yet been said aloud. People moved about their errands with unusual briskness, and those who paused to speak did so in lowered voices. The discovery of the glove and Miss Marple's pointed remarks about its damning persistence had spread through the village, magnified and twisted in the telling. No one could say exactly why Mrs. Hargraves had gone so pale, or why her hand had trembled, but everyone remembered it. In a village such as this, memory was always sharper when it concerned weakness. Inspector Craddock came to Miss Marple early, carrying his notes in untidy bundles and a face etched with fatigue. He found her in her rose garden, tying back a branch that had strayed too far across the path. She looked up mildly when he approached, as though she had been expecting him. "I cannot proceed without evidence, Miss Marple," he said, his voice heavy. "We have suspicion enough to drown the village in it, but suspicion is not proof. You saw her as I did. Mrs. Hargraves betrayed something, but what? She did not plunge the girl into the lake with her own hands, surely. And if she concealed the glove, why? The threads will not tie themselves." Miss Marple smiled faintly, brushing soil from her gloves. "Threads must always be tied by hand, Inspector, and it is very often the small, untidy ones that show where the fabric was tampered with. Do you recall the telegram from Much Benham? The aunt's evasions? The locket once belonging to Mrs. Arkwright? These are not stray threads. They are part of the weave. One must gather them together, and then the pattern will show." Craddock gave a weary sigh. And you, I suppose, can already see it. Not entirely, Miss Marple said softly, but clearly enough to know that poor Lydia did not die because of youth or recklessness. She died because she stumbled upon something meant to remain hidden. The locket was no gift of love at all. It was a token of guilt, long concealed, and Lydia, without knowing the full weight of it, held it in her hand. That was her death warrant. That evening Miss Marple requested that the inspector call a small gathering at the vicarage. The colonel and his wife were asked to attend, as were Guy Hargraves, Peter Harcourt, and Mrs. Cartwright. The village would expect such a meeting, for it had been clamouring for answers, and Craddock, though reluctant, agreed. He trusted Miss Marple's instinct by now, even when it seemed rooted less in evidence than in some quiet reading of human nature. The group assembled in the vicar's study, the air close and heavy with unspoken dread. Peter Harcourt sat rigid, his hands clenched on his knees. Guy Hargraves lounged with an ease that was more performance than comfort. Mrs. Cartwright perched stiffly, lips pressed tight, while Mrs. Hargraves sat very still, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. The colonel scowled at the entire proceeding, muttering about nonsense and indecent speculation. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat, beginning formally, but Miss Marple's gentle voice cut across the room before he could continue. "We need not waste time with formalities," she said, her knitting lying idle in her lap. "The truth is already before us if we have eyes to see it. Lydia Armitage was murdered not by jealous passion or youthful folly, but because she came into possession of a locket that bore witness to an older scandal. That locket once belonged to Evelyn Arkwright, whose debts were well known in Much Benham. But the debts were not all. She had a protector, someone who wished her supported, hidden, perhaps even silenced. That protector gave her the locket, and within it pressed a violet, not as a lover's keepsake, but as a token of remembrance. When Evelyn died, the locket should have vanished too, yet it reappeared in Lydia's hand. The room stirred uneasily. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and unblinking, turned to Mrs. Hargraves. "It was you who once wore that locket, was it not, my dear? You were Evelyn Arkwright before you married the colonel. You thought the past buried with your first name, but Lydia, poor child, stumbled upon it. Perhaps she found it in Much Benham. Perhaps it was returned to her through some careless chance. However it came, she knew it connected her to you. She did not understand its significance, but you did. And that knowledge filled you with terror." Mrs. Hargraves gave a faint cry, her hands rising as though to ward off the words. The colonel's face turned a violent red. "Absurd," he thundered. "My wife has no part in such things." "How dare you—" But Miss Marple continued, her tone as mild as ever. "When Lydia showed the locket, perhaps even hinted she knew to whom it had belonged, you realized everything might unravel. Your husband's pride, your nephew's future, your own position, all could be ruined by a whisper of scandal. So you took the one step you thought would end it. You went to her by the lake. You seized her wrist, tore the locket from her, and in the struggle she fell. Whether you meant her death or only her silence, the water closed over her, and you saw your chance to hide the truth. But the gloves betrayed you. One you burned along with other things, but the second was left behind in your haste. And when I spoke of gloves, you trembled." Mrs. Hargraves's composure cracked. A sob escaped her, thin and broken. "I did not mean," she whispered. "I only meant to frighten her. She was so young, so careless, laughing about things she could not possibly understand. She said she would ask me about the locket, that she had recognized the initials. I begged her to forget it. She would not. She mocked me. She said secrets never stayed buried in villages. She was right." The colonel surged to his feet, his voice harsh. "You will say no more. This is slander, outrageous." But Mrs. Hargraves had covered her face with her hands, sobbing. The truth was laid bare, and no bluster could conceal it. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his expression grim. He had his confession now, though it came not through cross-examination, but through the quiet persistence of an elderly woman who had seen through human nature too many times to be deceived. Miss Marple lifted her knitting once more, her eyes downcast. "It is always the little things that betray us," she said softly. "A locket, a flower, a glove. They may seem trifles, but trifles are what life is made of. And death, too." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Mrs. Hargraves's muffled sobs and the steady tick of the vicar's clock. At last Craddock gave the formal words, his duty now unavoidable. But it was Miss Marple who had already delivered the judgment. The days that followed the revelation at the vicarage were heavy with a silence unlike any St. Mary Mead had known before. It was not the silence of peace, but of shock, as though the entire village held its breath, unwilling to speak too loudly in case it stirred the echo of Lydia Armitage's name. The news travelled quickly, as it always did, but it spread with none of the usual relish. There was no triumph in the telling, no satisfaction in having guessed correctly. The truth had proved too raw, too near, and too intimate for comfort. Mrs. Hargraves's confession, half choked, half coerced from her lips, was never formally repeated in public, but it was enough. Inspector Craddock, methodical even in dismay, took the necessary steps with all the quiet firmness of duty. The colonel blustered and raged, but his authority only magnified the futility of his position. His household, once so rigidly kept, now seemed to sag around him, a structure whose foundations had been shaken beyond repair. Guy Hargraves, his charm stripped bare, was suddenly subdued, though whether from guilt of his own or the simple collapse of his borrowed arrogance was hard to say. Mrs. Cartwright kept to her rooms above the drapers, receiving visitors only reluctantly. She did not speak of her niece with tenderness, but her silence was fiercer than words, as though grief had cut her tongue. People speculated endlessly about what she had known, whether she had guessed at Lydia's secret knowledge, whether she had suspected Mrs. Hargraves's involvement, whether the telegram from Much Benham had been a warning of things already unravelling. But Mrs. Cartwright refused to clarify, and in time the village grew weary of pressing her. Peter Harcourt, though cleared of suspicion, walked about the lanes with a look of hollow defeat. His grief was honest, unvarnished, and entirely without the comfort of vindication. He had loved Lydia sincerely, and her death, coupled with the humiliation of having been suspected, weighed upon him with a quiet heaviness. Miss Marple watched him pass her garden one morning. His shoulders stooped, and thought with gentle sorrow that he would recover one day, but never wholly. Young men did not forget such things. The villagers themselves adjusted in their peculiar way. At the grocer's, voices returned to their chatter, though there was always a moment of hesitation before laughter resumed. At the tea shop, Mrs. Price Ridley declared that she had always suspected Mrs. Hargraves of a certain duplicity, though she had said no such thing at the time. Mrs. Bantry told the tale often, her swoon at the fete embellished with each retelling, until she became half convinced she had fainted with prophetic insight. The vicar's wife, Griselda, sighed that the village would return to its ordinary squabbles soon enough, though something in her tone suggested she was not certain whether that was a comfort, and through it all, Miss Marple remained her usual unobtrusive self, sitting by her window with her knitting or tending to her roses. Neighbours stopped by, eager to unburden themselves of theories or fears, and she listened kindly, never contradicting, never boasting of her part in the affair. She accepted their chatter with a faint smile, her needles clicking steadily, as though she had all the time in the world. It was only to Inspector Craddock, over a quiet tea at the vicarage, that she spoke more plainly. He was a practical man, and though he had seen her method before, he could never quite reconcile her gentle manner with her unerring clarity. "I shall never understand how you do it," he admitted, stirring his tea absently. "I chased after gloves and locks of hair, scratched hands and missing trinkets, and it led me only to circles. Yet you sit knitting in a corner, and somehow arrive at the truth." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes lowered to her cup. "It is really very simple, Inspector. One observes people, that is all. Human nature is remarkably consistent. A woman who has lived in fear of her past will always betray it in small, nervous ways. A guilty conscience makes people fuss over trifles, destroy what ought to be ignored, tremble at words that to others are meaningless. Poor Mrs. Hargraves betrayed herself at every turn. The glove was not proof, but it was enough to unsettle her. And once unsettled, she could not maintain the mask. Craddock shook his head. And Lydia herself? Was it only chance that she stumbled upon the locket? I think not, Miss Marple replied softly. Lydia was a clever girl, restless, dissatisfied. She was drawn to mysteries, though she did not understand the dangers. She may have come upon the locket by accident, but once she recognized its connection to Mrs. Hargraves, she could not resist pressing the point. Youth believes it can force truth into the light without consequence. It is the tragedy of her death that she learned otherwise. Craddock regarded her with a mixture of admiration and resignation. Do you make it sound inevitable? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. In a sense it was. Human nature, Inspector, is the most predictable thing in the world. One sees it played out in families, in friendships, in quarrels over trifles at jumble sales. Murder is only an extreme expression of the same weaknesses: fear, pride, vanity, resentment. We may call it extraordinary, but it is rooted in the ordinary. When Craddock left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically in the quiet room. Outside, the village was settling once more into its familiar patterns, the milk cart on its rounds, the church bell marking the hour, children darting across the green. Life, as it always did, resumed. Yet beneath the surface there lingered an unease, a reminder that beneath their hedges and roses, beneath their polite teas and well-swept doorsteps, there lay the same shadows found anywhere in the world. A week later, the fete grounds had been cleared of all evidence of the tragedy. The Colonel's lawns were once more immaculate, the lake calm and undisturbed. People spoke of the upcoming harvest, of small ailments, of the vicar's sermon. Yet now and again, when a pair of gloves was left behind on a church pew, or when a young girl was seen walking with a stranger near the station, voices lowered and glances were exchanged. The memory of Lydia Armitage's death was not forgotten. It had settled into the village like a stone at the bottom of the lake, unseen but always present. Miss Marple, watching the swallows dart across the evening sky, reflected quietly on the case. She had not sought it, yet it had unfolded before her as such things often did. She took no pride in her success, only a sober recognition that once again she had been right to trust her observations. Human nature, she thought, was a tapestry woven with threads of vanity, fear, and desire, and every so often those threads tightened into a knot so dark that only tragedy could unpick it. She resumed her knitting, the pattern growing steadily beneath her fingers. It was an ordinary evening in St. Mary Mead, as ordinary as any other, and yet touched by the knowledge that beneath its stillness, extraordinary things could and did occur. For that was the way of life and of death, in even the quietest of villages. The summer air softened as weeks passed, and St. Mary Mead seemed, on the surface, to return to its customary rhythm. Gardens were tended, gossip resumed its lighter tone, and children once more played freely on the green. Yet an undercurrent lingered, a quietness in conversations when the name Lydia Armitage was mentioned, and an instinctive glance toward Hargrave House whenever strangers came into view. Tragedy, Miss Marple reflected, always left its print behind. Villages, like people, bore scars even when they pretended otherwise. Mrs. Hargraves, frail and diminished, was removed to stay with distant relations. The Colonel, his bluster now hollow, walked the lanes with a kind of stiff bewilderment, as though uncertain whether to be more offended by his wife's betrayal of his pride or by the world's discovery of it. Guy Hargraves vanished back to London, his charm withered by disgrace. Mrs. Cartwright, resolutely silent, remained in her rooms above the drapers, neither condemned nor pitied, but regarded with a certain wariness. People had grown used to her severity, But suspicion lingered, as though she might one day disclose more than she had held back. Peter Harcourt carried his grief quietly, and though the village, eager to compensate for its earlier suspicions, now treated him with kindness, he remained withdrawn. Miss Marple, meeting him once along the church path, gave him her gentle smile. "Time, Mr. Harcourt," she said softly. "It does not heal, but it makes the burden easier to carry. You must let it." He nodded, though his eyes were still heavy with sorrow. And she knew it would be many years before Lydia's shadow ceased to walk beside him. Inspector Craddock returned to his duties, his admiration for Miss Marple's method growing, though he would never fully understand it. "You see it all as if it were written in plain words," he told her once, shaking his head. "Yet I chase after evidence and find only smoke." Miss Marple smiled, her hands busy with her knitting. "It is not written in words, Inspector, but in people. And people, you see, are dreadfully easy to read, if one has spent a lifetime observing them. A woman's tremor at a word, a young man's blush at a glance, an aunt's silence when she ought to speak, all are chapters in a book. Most readers hurry past, but if you turn the pages slowly, the story tells itself. The locket was locked away as evidence, but in Miss Marple's mind it remained the key. A trinket, yes, but weighted with memory and fear. The pressed violet inside had not been a symbol of romance, but of a past Mrs. Hargraves had hoped never to face. Lydia had stumbled upon it with the bold curiosity of youth, not realizing that secrets, however old, can still carry danger. In her innocence lay the cause of her death, and in her death lay the exposure of truths carefully hidden. Miss Marple thought often of that, how youth's brightness could brush too near to shadows and be extinguished. The villagers, of course, found ways to make sense of it in their own fashion. Some said it was a lesson in the folly of ambition. Others a warning against pride. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it a vindication of her long-held suspicions about modern women. Mrs. Bantry, recounting the events yet again, claimed she had swooned because she had foreseen the tragedy. The vicar's wife, with more honesty, admitted that the affair had left her unsettled, as though safety itself had been disturbed. But Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage by the fire as autumn drew near, reflected differently. Safety, she knew, was never absolute. Human nature, with its vanities and fears, made certain of that. Wherever people lived close together, whether in villages or cities, secrets thrived. And where secrets thrived, danger was never far away. Yet she did not brood. She accepted it with the calmness of one who had seen much and expected more. Evil, she knew, was not confined to the great cities or the wide world beyond. It nestled comfortably among roses and tea tables, disguised in politeness, waiting for a chance to emerge. One evening, as the church bell tolled softly in the dusk, Miss Marple folded away her knitting and looked out at the quiet street. Curtains glowed warmly, a dog barked in the distance, and somewhere a child laughed. Life, persistent and ordinary, continued. She thought of Lydia, of the broken locket, of Mrs. Hargraves's trembling hands, and then of all the small dramas that would soon take the village's attention, the harvest, the jumble sale, a new curate. The great storm had passed, leaving behind silence, sorrow, and the faint but certain knowledge that peace in St. Mary Mead was always a fragile thing. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes thoughtful. She had not sought the truth, but it had come to her as it always did. And she had done what was needed, not with drama but with quiet persistence. That was her way. She turned back to her chair, took up her knitting once more, and let the click of her needles accompany the fading light. The pattern grew row by row, steady and inevitable, just as human nature always was, and so the village settled. The scandal dimmed into memory. The lawns at Hargrave House grew neat again, and the lake lay still under the willow trees. Yet for those who had been touched by the affair, it would not be forgotten. For Lydia Armitage had left behind not only a broken locket, but a lesson, that in even the most peaceful of villages, the secrets people guard most closely are the ones that hold the greatest danger. Miss Marple, ever gentle, ever watchful, carried that knowledge with her as she always had. She did not need to speak of it. She simply observed, knitting quietly, ready for the next pattern of human weakness to reveal itself, for it always would.